Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and this is kind of a follow-up video on my previous one, which was about whether or not the Orville is actually better than the old Star Trek shows. And I said how I think the Orville is cleaning up some of the ideas from Star Trek and doing them in a new way even better than they were done before. I also criticized the Orville for not having as many fresh new ideas as the Star Trek shows had when they were first coming out. They were doing so many new things which not a lot of other shows or movies did before, and so they were much more innovative, they were much more imaginative, and the Orville is doing that a little bit, but not enough, not as much as the old Star Trek used to do when they were coming out. So that was one of my complaints, and I also said I do think the Orville is like a good remake of Star Trek because they're taking the best ideas and doing them even better sometimes, not always. It's not as original, it doesn't feel as innovative as the old Star Trek shows. Anyway, if you want to hear my full analysis, full breakdown of all of those elements, all of those points, listen to my previous video in which I really analyzed and compared them. But one of the points I wanted to talk about, and I decided to leave it a separate video because it's a big topic, is something which Star Trek did wrong, which I think the Orville is actually doing much better the way it should have been done in the first place. And I complained about that and I joked about that a lot in the past, is the way that they kind of set up their alien races and then they treat those races in a racist ways. Even though Star Trek in many ways was very much anti-racism, so it was kind of very strange contradiction in Star Trek, because on the one hand they were very much anti-racism, they had a lot of good anti-racism messages. For example, they showed all of humanity is united in the future, they're all working together, there is no more racism in between humans, no one judges any other person based on stuff like that. They're all equal, they all treat each other with respect, no one ever says, oh, you're black, or you're a woman, or something like that, and then therefore you're not this or that. So they always show the future society of humanity as it should be, with all races, all genders, all being equal, all being given the equal opportunities. We never see any racism or bigotry in between characters on the show. And that's great, that's one of the good things about Star Trek, that's one of the things I always love to see in Star Trek. But on the other hand, when it comes with all the alien species, all the alien races they invented on the show, then they kind of came back to exactly the same problems we have today. And if those alien races are to be used as kind of an allegory to real issues today, then how can you do that? How can you basically use those aliens in a stereotypical ways? Let me give you a few specific examples. Let's look at how they treated the Klingons. So they established the Klingons as that other race of aliens, and then they kind of show them all being the same way. So they're all always angry, they're all barbarians, they all enjoy violence and stuff like that. They give all kinds of traits for that species, that race of people from space. And they even have a character from that race on the ship, always on the ship, Lieutenant Worf, and they show him as being kind of internally angry. So he's not angry because of his culture, they even make a point to say that he was raised by humans, and yet he's still always angry because that's his nature. And even when they introduced the character of his girlfriend, and she was totally against the whole Klingon culture and all of that, and despite that she even told to Counselor Troy that she has that internal monster, that she has that rage coming from inside, and that makes her very angry, and she breaks the tables for no reason and stuff like that. So they always show that the Klingons are like that from their very nature. And I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong. I'm not saying we cannot play with that idea, because it is possible to have some kind of alien with different psychology because of their biology. So I'm not necessarily saying it's wrong to explore that kind of idea, but when you use aliens on Star Trek to be telling morality tales and to compare it with humanity, with the different groups of people and how they deal with each other, then it kind of becomes a problem, because it's the same exact way of thinking as racist people do, and therefore it kind of becomes a problem by itself. Like all these races in Star Trek, they're obviously made up so no one would get offended from the viewers, and so that's maybe why they allow themselves to do it that way. Imagine if they replaced any of the races on Star Trek with some kind of real country, a real nationality, or a real race, and just have it be that race, and they all behave that certain way. That would be extremely racist, right? And yet they do it with these imaginary races, and then no one gets offended because it's not a real race, and then that's kind of fine. But if you really think about it, it's not fine. It promotes the same kind of way of thinking. And the best example is probably the Ferengi. Like, they established the Ferengi as a species, the race with certain features, and they're all like that, at least until Deep Space Nine. Deep Space Nine kind of did start to add complexity to different characters. They showed that not every member of a species is exactly the same as the rest of the species. So Deep Space Nine was better in that regard. But in TNG, it was always very one-dimensional. So all the Klingons are violent and angry, all the Ferengi are greedy, and they're all thieves, they're all liars. And they even had characters tell that to the Ferengi. Like Picard met some random Ferengi on the planet Risa, and he basically tells to his face that all the Ferengi are this or that. So imagine if that was some real race that he was talking to on the show. That would sound extremely racist, right? How can you judge someone just because of his species? Just, oh, so he's a Ferengi, he has big ears, and that means he must be a liar, a thief, and so on. So if that was a real race, that would sound extremely bigoted. And therefore, Star Trek is kind of betraying its own ideas. Like, if it wants to promote the idea that everybody deserves a chance, no one should be judged according to his race or his gender, you shouldn't mistrust someone just because of his race. So, all those good ideas which they kind of promoted with the idea showing all the crew of humans all working together, never having any trouble based on any of those things, and yet they do that to the aliens. So, they have these different kinds of aliens, and all members of the specific aliens, they're always like that. And we have the hero characters behave toward them in what would be a racist way if there were real humans. And the show even shows that that really is the case. Like, they're not doing that and then finding out, oh, that Ferengi was actually a good guy. No, it's almost always turns out to be true. So one episode they saved a bunch of Ferengi. They saved 2 Ferengi from some ship. They let them stay as guests on the ship, and then we see the Ferengi when they're alone actually scheming against the ship and doing stuff with the kind of, oh, that accident was not really an accident, that was their way to get on board the Enterprise because they knew they will save them, and they're exploiting that against them, and they are actually kind of evil and greedy and all of that. So the show keeps showing us that really is the case. All members of a species or that race and that race, they are really all like that. Or the Cardassians the same way, all the Cardassians are kind of tyrannical, dictatorial. That's in their nature. That's how they like it to be. And every one of them is like that. Even when they showed some Cardassian woman coming up to O'Brien, wanting to meet with O'Brien, and she was turned on when O'Brien was being kind of an asshole toward her. That's what turned her on, because I guess in her species, they love aggression. Like, aggression is a good thing for them. So just like the Klingons are just, their aggression comes from within, from their biology. So that's how the show always showed it to us. We see bigotry by a member of the crew, a main character, being bigoted against an alien without knowing anything about that person except for his race, and behaving toward him based on that race. But then before we can even question that in our minds, we see that that individual really is behaving in that way, which is nasty. So the show kept kind of reinforcing that kind of way of thinking. Only in the later shows, like especially Deep Space Nine, they started showing, oh, so not all the Klingons are like that, not all the Ferengi are like that. They did have a few good Ferengi, a few good Cardassians. So they kept showing us. So that's one of the reasons I really love Deep Space Nine, in some ways even more than TNG, because they kind of stopped being childish and stopped being so one-dimensional with their characters and their species, and started really exploring the topics in a more complex way, and that was great about Deep Space Nine. But one of the flaws in TNG was that one-dimensional, bigoted way of thinking toward their own races. And another very important example, which I want to compare with the Orville, is in the episode in which Worf's son Alexander came on board the Enterprise, and he put him in school. And then Alexander is behaving like an angry, wild child, and frightening the other children, and he's kind of growling at them and stuff. So he's behaving like a small Klingon and basically bullying the other children, and he steals stuff from other children and stuff like that. And that was in that episode when his mother was still alive, and we know that his mother, Kaylar, was not really teaching him according to Klingon traditions, so we cannot blame the culture for that. It wasn't because he was being taught in the Klingon way that he was behaving in that way. He behaved that way because it's in his nature, it's his biological nature to be more angry and all of that. So that's a bit of a problem, because it's kind of a racist idea. If we want to play around with all these aliens on Star Trek as a metaphor to different cultures on our planet, then we can't really do stuff like that, because it promotes the same idea as racism. The thought that, oh, he belongs to that race, that means he must be this or that by his very nature. That's a racist idea. One which I oppose, which I object to. I think every person, no matter what the race, if he is educated the right way, would be just as good as a person as someone from a different race. I think everybody should be given a chance, a fair opportunity, a fair chance to prove themselves, to give the tools to everybody. It's wrong to really exclude people based on that. So that's something I disliked in Star Trek whenever they did that to their own aliens, even though it's not a real race, but it promotes that way of thinking, and that goes against what Star Trek always pretended to be, at least to be all against racism. And if I compare that scene with Alexander to a scene in the Orville in which we saw Bortus's son, Topa, also behaving in a bad way in class, he also steals stuff from other children. And so when I saw that, I immediately remembered that scene with Alexander behaving that way. But what they did better in the Orville is that they made it clear that the reason he's behaving that way is not because of his nature, it's not because he's angry by nature, by his biology, but because he was taught bad things by one of his parents, by Clyden, who taught him that females are not as good as males, that females are lesser beings, that you can steal from the females and stuff like that. So his behavior was a result of his bad education by one of his parents, and that's why he was behaving like that. And therefore we know he can also be re-educated. We know that someone can teach him a lesson and he will understand why he behaved wrong and so on, and he can become just as good of a person as any other person, just as any other human. And so I think this is a perfect example of what the Orville did better than Star Trek. If we compare these two scenes back to back, we see that Star Trek did it in a stupid way, which kind of promotes a racist way of thinking, that, oh, Alexander is a Klingon, even though he was raised by someone who doesn't believe in Klingon culture. She believes more in human values and all of that, but despite of that, he behaves in an angry, aggressive way because he's a Klingon and that's his nature, that's his biological nature. And therefore we know that all Klingons are problematic in that sense. And in the Orville we have a scene with Toppa also behaving badly in class, but we discover quickly after that he's only behaving that way because that's the way he was taught. And therefore it's not the fault of his biology, of his race, of his species. And so the lesson here is much better. The lesson in the Orville is the correct lesson, that you should educate your children the right way, and then they would be good people, and that's the correct message you want to bring to your audience. And so this is an example of something that the Orville did much better than TNG. The Orville did that kind of idea not in a racist way, while TNG was kind of racist. Whenever they show that this or that race, every member of that race have those traits which are negative, which have nothing to do with education. So that's a mistake if you want to use these aliens as a metaphor to real people. If not, then that's okay. I think it is okay to show, some evil race of insects or something. They're all bad, they only want to eat us all or something. That's fine, you can have those kinds of aliens. But if you have an alien race which you want to use as an allegory, a metaphor to real issues today, especially dealing with racism and stuff like that, then you cannot insert those kinds of racist ideas, like showing them all having that kind of trait, like they're all violent because of their nature, because that is a racist idea. And so that's one of the things that kind of annoyed me in Star Trek a lot of times. And the Orville actually cleaned that up and did it the right way. And I'm curious to see what people will say, so let me know in the comments what you think about this topic, and we can discuss it in the comment section. If you want to hear the rest of my thoughts on my comparison between the Orville and Star Trek, check out my previous video, in which I talk about a lot more similarities and differences between the Orville and the rest of the Star Trek shows. So I hope you enjoyed the video, let me know what you think, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.